Buenas noches, welcome to Centro. It's my great pleasure to have you here tonight. It is a great occasion when we celebrate a book, and in this particular case, we have a distinguished panel, which our moderator, Arnaldo Cruz Malavé, Dr. Cruz Malavé is actually the director of the Literature and Romance Language at Fordham University. Close enough.
Close enough. Department of Modern Language.
Modern Language. Okay.
It includes a few languages that are not Romance.
Oh, okay.
Like Arabic and Chinese, which I speak perfectly.
Well, that's way too much for me to remember. But in any case, it is my pleasure to have you all here. As you can see, we're recording and taping all our events. It turns out that the Puerto Rican population now is dispersed all over the globe, but certainly throughout the United States. And so Centro, our mission has to expand to reach out to every corner where anyone might be interested in the kind of discussions that we are going to have here tonight. So we make a point of recording and eventually uploading in our website. I invite you to visit that site and to get familiar with all the events and all the wonderful information that you can access through the Centro portal. So without too much more introductions, I want to leave you with a wonderful panel on Puerto Rican writers, particularly tonight. So, Dr. Cruz Malavé, por favor. I was told to bring this to you. Is that right, Nari? Yeah. So let me
just stand there. Should I?
Is this one?
Oh. Rosalie, what do you think we should do? I think this is for taping purposes. You
can just place it on the table.
Okay.
Yeah, place it on the table.
And the other one is going to.
It'll pick up. It'll pick up. It's picking up very well. The two microphones.
Sorry for that.
Thank you.
I thought I had my instructions clear. Gracias.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess, Well, it is, I'm so glad that Vanessa invited me. It is a distinct pleasure. It just forced me, really, because we're all very busy, of course. So this was a very pleasurable thing because it actually forced me to take some time out to read the book. And I actually did. So I have the distinct pleasure of introducing today the panelists and the authors of the book, including Vanessa Pérez Rosario, who's the editor of this wonderful book, this wonderful collection of Puerto Rican, yes, but not only Puerto Rican, Hispanic, Caribbean writers, Hispanic, Caribbean literature of migration, narratives of displacement. And the phrase literature of migration, literatura de la inmigración, harkens back in my mind immediately and in Puerto Rican literary history to the great migration of Puerto Ricans to New York. And after World War II, as a result of, we all know, the process of industrialization that has been much studied. Literature of migrations also conjures up in our minds the writing of Hispanic Caribbeans and Puerto Ricans in the U.S. as either a chapter in the national literary history of the island or of the islands, or as this separate alternative, as a separate alternative literary history of the Puerto Rican and Hispanic Caribbean communities in the United States. Literatura nacional versus literatura de la inmigración. Institutions like El Centro have for the past 4 decades enriched our knowledge of this other literary history through the discovery and preservation of texts. And thanks to their work, we can now say that the literary history of the Hispanic Caribbean diaspora does not begin with the massive migration of Puerto Ricans to New York, but after World War II, or with the exile of Dominicans in the aftermath of the Civil War of 1965, or with the exodus of Cubans after Mariel. It begins in the 19th century when intellectual activists, revolutionaries, and reformers from the islands met in New York. And it is tied to the turn of the century anarchist movements. And it includes towering canonical figures such as Martí, Luisa Capetillo, Juan Bosch, Julia de Burgos. But the literature of migration that this new, exciting, and provocative book, Hispanic Caribbean Literature of Migration, edited by Vanessa, refers to is neither the canonical island literary history nor a separate alternative Latino literary tradition. Instead, the literature of migration that Vanessa's book would have us contemplate is one that is plural and that is traversed by what the Arab American literary and cultural critic Edward Said has called the migrants contrapunto, using the musical term, contrapunto, double legacy and vision. One that is aware of and makes us aware of the simultaneous pull of parallel contradictory terms like national identity, sexuality, citizenship, race. Thus, the Martí, explored by Laura Lomas, in her contribution to the book, is not the Martí who returned to die in Cuba and whose every word has been minutely and painstakingly dissected and glossed by the Centro de Estudios Martianos in Havana. That was funny, right? The Martí of her reading is, as she calls them, using the French theoretician Gilles Deleuze, is a minor author. Minor, not in the sense that he is too small, although he was rather small, but because he is too large. He's too difficult to pin down. He's too difficult to fix and contain as if he were a monument. It is the Puerto Rican migratory Martí of Julio Ramos and of the Cuban writer Antonio José Ponte, who relates this wonderful story about Martí's last day in New York, right before he left for Cuba to die. In his last day in New York, Martí, who was a tiny and frail man with a voice that could kind of make you unsettle you or make you quiver and sweep you away, left in a friend's apartment his oversized, shoddy winter coat. It would be picked up by the Dominican writer Pedro Enriquez Ureña one day when he was visiting New York, and New York was undergoing one of its legendary snowstorms. And it would be lost and reappear again in southern Spain, worn by, of course, a gypsy beggar. Or in Peru, by a lady, by an Indian lady with a derby hat. That is, a non-canonical, tentative, contradictory, ephemeral, and useful Martí is the one that is recovered for us by Laura Lomas. Nor is the Julia de Burgos studied by Vanessa the institutionalized canonical icon whose name appears in the title of several centers and schools, as necessary as this is. I'm not knocking it. I think more schools should be named after her. But the Julia who keeps being reinterpreted and fought over by Puerto Ricans from the island and Puerto Ricans from New York, by straight and lesbian Puerto Ricans and Latinos. But the Julia de Burgos, whose dead body would be lost by her family because it had been buried in an unmarked municipal grave, and who had and has to be exhumed by all of us every so often. The Julia who will not let us rest. And it is finally the migratory Thomas Piritomas of Yolanda Martínez San Miguel, whose founding book of New York Puerto Rican letters is so strange, so simple and yet so complex, so conflicted and so brilliant, because he refuses, against his better judgment, to settle on any of the multiple racial legacies that envelop us as Puerto Ricans and that both enrich and threaten to destroy us. The Piritomas, who in Yolanda's nuanced and complex colonial, post-colonial reading, keeps wrestling with a colonial history as he attempts to move toward an Afro-Puerto Rican affirmative world. These are just some, this is sampling, okay? Just like the postrecitos allá. This is a sampling. These are some of the migrations and displacements that Vanessa's book would have us contemplate. And they are as unsettling as they are enriching. I would like now, maybe we could now have a taste, to continue the postre metaphor, have a taste of these readings, but from the authors themselves. So I'd like to introduce you to the authors. Let me see. I have not memorized their biography, okay? Laura Lomas, who is Associate Professor of English and Acting Director of the Women's Studies Program at Rutgers University, where she teaches ethnic and immigrant writing of the United States. Laura is really well known as the author of Translating Empire, José Martí, Migrant Latino Subjects, and American Modernities. Next to Laura is Vanessa Pérez Rosario, who is Associate Professor of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies. No?
Assistant.
Assistant. I promoted you right now.
It's on my team.
I promoted you. And Latino Studies, you should be Puerto Rican and Latino Studies at the City University of New York, Brooklyn College. Her research specialty, she's the editor of this book. She wrote a wonderful introduction. She's working on, she will be talking about Julia de Burgos, and she's working on this fantastic book on Julia de Burgos. And of course, my very good friend, Yolanda Martínez San Miguel, who has published immensely, so I won't mention any of the things that she has published. She is back at Rutgers, for those of you who knew her when she was back at another university. She's at Rutgers now. She is the author of Saberes Americanos, Subalternidad y Epistemología en los Escritos de Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Caribe Two Ways, a classic in the field of literature of migration. Caribe Two Ways, Cultura de la Migración en el Caribe Insular Hispánico. From lack to excess, so she does both, lack and excess, lack to excess, minor readings of Latin American colonial discourse, and like 20 other books. Okay, it's all right. Okay, so I'll leave you with Laura, who will be speaking on Martín.
Thank you so much, Arnaldo, and thank you, Vanessa, for putting this panel together, for creating this beautiful book. And thanks also to the Center for Puerto Rican Studies for making possible so much of the research that we do. So I'm here as an Americanist who does work in Latino literature of the late 19th century, and specifically I spent a lot of time reading Martín in that framework. And our time is marked by the largest migration in the history of the United States since the late 19th century. So we're in a time of redefinition of US American culture. And I think this book significantly contributes to that process of redefinition. I think that the book is a path-breaking work precisely for all the reasons that Arnaldo said, in terms of defining this migration not as a unidirectional phenomenon, and that's certainly the case for Martí. But what I wrote about in my chapter really is focused in part on Martí as someone who was interpreting the late 19th century United States from the site of New York City in a process of industrialization, in a period of racial terror. But that interpretation is very much enabled or made possible by the archive that has been recreated and reimagined, specifically by the work of Puerto Rican scholars. So definitely Julio Ramos, who wrote Desencuentros de la Modernidad, and which has been translated as Divergent Modernities. But I'm also thinking of the important work of Nicolás Caneos, the Puerto Rican who in Houston, Texas, in the midst, very much an epicenter of Chicano culture, but he's there conducting this over a decade-long archival project of creating the largest archive of works written in Spanish and English that provides us a much longer history of Latino and Chicano writing in what is now the United States. And that archive and the reinterpretive process makes it possible to rethink a different version of Martí. And in a sense, what happens in the work of this reappropriation of these characters, what we learn from Julio Ramos is that coloniality, well, first of all, the experience of Chicano and Latinidad is not one strictly of a kind of US ethnic framework, but actually one of coloniality. And that coloniality demands migration. Migration is a kind of point of departure for Latin American diasporic writing. Migration enables greater access to knowledge. It makes it possible, in the case of Martí, to escape. He was deported from Cuba in 2 different occasions, to organize resistance in a clandestine fashion, and then also to come into contact with other migrant writers who congregated in this urban center. And that process of congregation not only transformed those writers, but also transforms the landscape of New York, right? So one of the things that I found really interesting is the way that Martí writes about, and was sort of so interested in how New York was being transformed. Like the largest restaurant in New York, the most prestigious restaurant in New York, Delmonico's, was taken over by all these Latin American intellectuals who were part of a diaspora living in New York. And they put up all the flags and these palm trees, and they had, so they transformed that restaurant. And other sites in the city, hotel lobbies became congregating spots. Certain hotels were demarcated and thought of themselves as specifically hosting. They had like a Latino floor, and that's how it was referred to. So that kind of tropicalization, as critics have begun to refer to it, was actually going on much earlier. So living in the metropolis, in the belly of the empire, generates this new subjectivity that pertains neither to the Caribbean nor to the United States. And this new lens, I'm suggesting, provides a new way of interpreting traditions in far-reaching ways. So in the case of Julio Ramos, because he was someone who was my teacher, and I just find his work so influential, but he's also begun to write novels. And so that's one of the things that I take up in my chapter, is sort of his novel. And I look at how he appropriates and remakes Martí, and he refers to him as a Boricua, a New Yorican Martí, right? Or who loves and hates New York as only a Boricua could. So that Martí's not specific. I mean, it sort of takes Martí out of that vice grip between the Cuban nationalist, Martí is the author of the Cuban Revolution, versus the Cuban American Foundation, Martí is the anti-Castro, weapons storage. So it takes him out of that dilemma and really transforms and enriches, I think, our reading of Martí. And what I'm suggesting is that this is a specifically Puerto Rican lens. I mean, that's one of the things I realized in writing this chapter, that it's a way of reading that opens up our thinking about these figures. It opens up the whole U.S. American literary, the modernist tradition, because another character besides Martí is also William Carlos Williams, who stayed up late drinking with Julio Ramos's in Rutherford, East Rutherford. You know, now I live in Newark, so I drive through all these random towns in New Jersey, and that's where William Carlos Williams was in Ramos's reimagining of William Carlos Williams's connection with his Puerto Rican heritage via his mother and grandmother. So and then lastly, the last person, of course, is Vanessa Pérez, right? Who, in creating this book, you know, shows that we, in a sense, we can think Puerto Rican history without putting it into relationship with these other traditions, but also shows the crucial role of a Puerto Rican lens in thinking about Hispanic, Caribbean, and Latino American traditions in the United States. I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, I wasn't even looking at, I lost track of time. That's how compelling it was. So first I want to thank my contributors for trusting me with their work. And wow, I started this project when I was a graduate student. So it was really great of you to participate first in a panel in a seminar that I organized at a conference, and that led into the idea behind this project. And also thank you to the Centro de Estudios Puerto Ricanos. They've been very supportive of my work. I was here for a semester last semester, actually, the spring 2010 semester, and that allowed me to finish the final edits for this book and all of the review, you know, looking at the final reviews that came from the publisher. So I want to thank them for giving me the time and space to work on this. I'm going to talk a little bit about my chapter on Julia de Burgos, and I think I'll start with a story about Martí too. I thought of this today, actually, because my parents are in town, so I think that's what made me think about it. But I remember, as a child, going to visit the Niagara Falls, and my father, who is Cuban, said, we started talking about Jose Martí, and he explained, and I must have asked a question about, you know, what side was Martí on, and he explained to me that Martí was picked up by both the revolution, the you know, Fidel's revolution, and by those Cubans of the diaspora. So I thought that was very interesting, and I was a child, so I didn't really understand all the politics behind it, but what occurred to me is that was sort of the same question that led me into my project on Julia de Burgos, and I don't think that I realized that when I started my dissertation, but that was the question that initiated this project and my interest in Julia de Burgos, was how is it that the Puerto Rican nationalists, you know, on the island claim her, and she participated in that movement during the 1930s, and still just have to go up to El Barrio and see the way that she's inscribed in the culture of El Barrio. And that was really the initial question that started my dissertation process and sort of led me into the study of Julia de Burgos. So I think I thought of that today because my parents are here. But that's where I started on this project, and after spending a lot of time thinking about it, and one of the things that I realized, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to go into a bio of Julia, although there's a little bit of it in my chapter. But one of the things that I realized, I think, is that you know, there are some critics on the island, some of the ways that she's been read on the island, particularly in a biography that's been written of her, sort of sees her almost as a metonymy for the island. She gets consumed by the city of New York in the same way that the island of Puerto Rico gets consumed by U.S. imperialism. Wow. And then from some of it seems that in many ways, with the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, she gets taken up by those movements as a symbol for the importance of community and solidarity. So my project sort of goes on the belief that both communities, both of those readings miss her because they don't focus on her work enough and they focus too much on her biography. So so in my chapter, I briefly look at the ways, and this chapter is really part of a larger book, a book-length study that I'm working on this year. So in the chapter and in the book, I look at the way that really, if you look carefully at the writings that she did during the 1930s, you can notice, although she very much believed in Puerto Rican nationalism, she dissented from the way that nationalism was defined on the island. Her poetry indicates that very clearly. And then she, in her writing, she finds different sort of escape routes from that narrow nationalism, and is then taken up by writers from the 70s, both on the islands and in the diaspora, who see her sort of as they almost look back to her as part of an alternative literary tradition, and take her up as a subject of much of their work in that way. And I focus, in the chapter, I think I focus particularly on writers such as Mariposa and Sandra Maria Esteves, in the opposite order, I guess. Sandra Maria Esteves first, who's of an earlier generation, and then Mariposa, but looking at the way that Nuyorican writers, and in the book I'll also be looking at the way that Nuyorican visual artists, women in particular, take her up as the subject of their artwork and the subject of their writing, and in this way sort of create communities of resistance. So that's my project at large, and I look very closely also at her newspaper writing, and the way that she articulated already in the 1940s this ideas around transnationalism, the importance of looking at the communities here and their relationship to the communities at home. So I think maybe I'll stop there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll definitely have questions for you.
Okay.
So, okay.
Well, I would like to begin by thanking Vanessa again, because the invitation was very timely when I'm working in a book project as well. And then Vanessa contacted me, and it sounded as something that would begin the possibility of new questions, no? And so, she came with a proposal that actually started, if I remember correctly, at an ACLA conference, probably, no? And I felt that there was something new that she was trying to propose, and that it was going to push me, actually, out of my comfort zone, to work this book from a different angle. And I also need to thank the Centro, because I was here for a year when I was doing my research from Caribe Two Ways. And I came here like as an assistant professor, with no anything, it's just a question and a lot of curiosity and a need for help, and everybody here welcomed me and helped me. So it's great to be back to present this book and to present my work at the Centro, because I felt in connection from the beginning here. And in terms of my contribution to the anthology, it emerges from my desire of moving out a little bit from my emphasis on Hispanic Caribbean studies. No? After writing Caribe Two Ways and teaching several courses, I became curious of establishing more connections between the Hispanic Caribbean, the French Caribbean, and the Anglo-Caribbean. And it's actually quite interesting that we're here with Arnaldo, because Arnaldo has an article in which he links Piri Thomas and Franz Fanon. No? And just like it's a brilliant article, Guatatango Web, Masculinidad y Abyección y la Fundación de la Literatura Puertorriqueña en Estados Unidos. No? And so when I read that article and I saw that Arnaldo was linking these two figures, it actually made me remember that I had read Fanon when I was an undergraduate student, and it was just like it passed, like something that I didn't even connect to my current work on Caribbean studies. So I went back to read Fanon. And when I was reading Fanon and I was looking at the way he describes these experiences of being an Antillean in Paris, particularly, in Black Skins, White Masks, book that he published in 1952, I started seeing some connections with my memory of Down These Mean Streets. No? And so I became curious about the fact that I saw both of them asking a similar question. What happens when you identify as something that doesn't have a name. No? And Piri was very interesting in that regard, because even years after publishing Down These Mean Streets, he kept insisting that he didn't write Puerto literature. No? And yet we say that he founded like the narrative, so we give him this responsibility, and he doesn't think that he's writing that kind of literature. And actually, if you go back, by going back and reviewing the ways in which the novel was read at the, when it was first published, it was received as a white mainstream narrative of rehabilitation, and not necessarily as a Latino narrative, no? And so I decided to read Black Skin, White Mask and Down These Mean Streets together, and see what were the common experiences that were shared by these Antillians that are, in one case, going back to Paris to get his training as a psychiatrist and finding out that he's a black man, he's seen as a black man, no? And Piri Thomas was born in the United States, and then is grappling with this identification as a black man, because he doesn't feel that he's a white man, and he doesn't have the concept of Hispanic or Latino to identify with, no? And so what I do in the chapter is I find several parallel scenes in which the process of arriving to a black identity, it's imposed by the way in which they are perceived by people in the metropolis. No? And so it's not something that they thought about themselves at the beginning. It's a process of racialization, and that prompts them to write narratives for that. No? And of course, the famous train scene in which a little kid sees Fanon and screams a black man, and he's afraid of him, is one of the scenes that I studied Frank Fanon. And in Piri Thomas's case, most people have focused on the moments in which he goes back to the South, and he tries to identify with an African-American culture there. No? But I'm more interested about the chapter in which he goes back to Texas. And he says that he goes out of the two-tone South. And he finds Hispanics as an alternative to the bipolar definition of identity in the United States. No? And so it's a chapter that sort of suggests a new direction, something that there's no language at that particular point in time, and that he's trying to pose as a possibility, as an alternative. No? And the chapter also tries to do a historical reading, because we have the advantage now of having brown, Latino, Hispanic, and all the tons of categories that we have now to classify these individuals, no? But I want to read them in their own time frame, when those terms did not exist, and how they create them through narrative, through fiction, no? And so that's more or less what I do in the chapter, and I will stop now, and I think that we can talk.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much. Well, I think I have a few ideas, but I think I'll open up to questions and comments. Open the floor up to you. Questions, comments?
Concerns? I say that in my class, yeah.
Concerns, are you
Traumas.
concerned? Yeah. Well, yes, okay.
I'm curious about the development of what is called Latino, particularly as it relates to the African American experience in the United States, and the evolution of mulatto, and how mulatto became a way that all of these ethnic hybrids found some type of understanding of who they were in relation to the other forces, because I think you'd mentioned the bipolar South, right? And so the idea that you were either white or you were colored had existed all the way through the 19th century. And so in terms of Latinos, especially in places further south, like Louisiana or Florida, where you had these very vibrant mixes of people and languages, did you see any connection to that evolution of Latino coming out of that mulatto conception, or was it something separate from that?
I can talk a bit about the late 19th century.
Sure.
Well, and it's interesting because precisely that process of racialization, I see instances of that going on in very private writings. You know, sort of, a diary about an encounter with a porter in the hotel who's reacting to Martí's accent, for example, but this feeling of being racialized. And also we see in the writings of the time, in Martí's writings, references to his perspective as specifically a Latino perspective, or the lips that he's using to articulate a point of view as labios latinos, or so there, it's not obviously not the same term Latino that we're using today. It's a radically different context, but there's already a kind of insinuation that the term was beginning to circulate, and it has everything to do with projects of expansion, the way that the United States was beginning to view, well, sort of had been viewing since the early 1800s, really. I mean, going back to 1816 with Henry Clay, and then, you know, the Monroe Doctrine, but then, you know, this idea that eventually Cuba was going to fall into the sphere of power of the United States, that led to this circulation of this term Latin already in the 1890s. Latin as opposed to sort of Saxon. But the terms that Martí uses, interestingly, because he spent time in Mexico and Guatemala, so he was aware of kind of all these variations of mixtures. He would often use the word mestizo.
Okay.
Yeah.
But also he referred to nuestras tierras híbridas.
Yeah.
And so there's this whole idea of hybridity that's emerging. But he also uses the term mulatto. This is, I mean, like referring to Du Bois or Lucy Parsons or you know, other people like that. So it's I mean, and then of course criollo,
Yeah.
right, which is another term. I mean, it was interesting. I was just with Yolanda, we were working with, I was meeting Henry, Paget Henry, and he was really recuperating the term Creole as a term that is part of a liberatory project of the Americas, not necessarily the sort of like the exotic Creole, because that's one of the terms that Martí really criticizes, is all the sort of light-skinned, privileged people who only were focusing on Europe and wanted nothing to do with the mestizo and hybrid mixed peoples that made up the majority of their countries.
I also had a comment that has, you know, is related to that, and that I think has to do with the fact that when you do comparative studies, the terms that we use are very interesting and are very, for me, they're fascinating because they actually trace a history of how races have been imagined. And in the case of the Hispanic Caribbean, we are at the crossroads. You know, we take the language that comes from Latin America, Central America, and also from the United States as well, no? And so when we talk about mestizaje, for example, which is a term that was coined in 1925 by Vasconcelos, the definition of mestizaje was actually a mixture of indigenous and European, no? And so that term was adopted in the Hispanic Caribbean much more, I think, than mulatto, even though in the 19th century you find the tragic mulatta as an important figure that will connect, for example, I'm thinking about Cecilia Valdez, which is like the very well-known example, with the same experiences in the south of the United States and also in the French Caribbean. In the French Caribbean, they use the term mulatto as well, no? And so the circulation of some of these terms are linked to particular languages, no? And so it is not until later, like for example, a term like mulataje, which has reemerged recently, is a term that, as far as I know, and I haven't traced the term, you know, I haven't tried to do research on this, but Licia Fiolmata mentions that Gabriela Mistral uses the term when she goes to Brazil. And so she finds this mixture, but it's not a mixture with indigenous populations only. It includes African population, and she talks about mulataje, no? And so this is a term that is gaining a lot of critical repute right now. Many people are talking about the process of mulataje to distinguish it from mestizaje that is so commonly used in like Latin America. I'm thinking about the Andean and the Mexican region. However, there are all these historians that are conducting archival research in the colonial period in Mexico and Peru, and they're finding out that the African population was there. There is a lot of mixture that was erased historically, no? In the case of Honduras, there is an assistant professor, I think, in Washington, that is tracing the use of the word Ladino, and Ladino is a way of erasing blackness in Honduras, no? And so we have to go back to these terms and see the way in which they are sort of like a way of terming a particular racial mixture and then erasing others, no? And so that would be sort of like, you know, a response to your question. But it's interesting that, for example, for Thomas and Fanon, the possibility of being a mulatto is not the solution. They just want to press the issue, and so they claim blackness instead of mulattoness. No?
I think Julia does claim She claims mostly mestizaje.
Mm-hmm.
But her use of terms, I think, is really interesting because it changes radically in her writing. She's not really consistent, and I think that her sense of identity changes as she moves from Puerto Rico. Then she spends a couple of years in Cuba, and she thinks more of a hemispheric identity. Well, or of a Latin American identity, I think, while she's in Cuba, and then she moves to New York and starts to think of a hemispheric identity. And at that point, she starts to talk about Latino, which she talks about promoting Latino culture in the United States in the 1940s. It was actually 1942, which is a very early use of that word, I think. But then she kind of uses it interchangeably with Latin American. So I'm not really sure where her conception of Latino, but I think what she tends to claim mostly in her writing is more mestizaje, but if the idea of mestizaje, the way that Vasconcelos, if mestizaje is about racial whitening, that's not what she does. That's not her definition of it. So I think that that's important to remember in the way that she thinks of mestizaje. If you look specifically at some of her poetry, like Rio Grande de Loíza, Ay, ay, ay de la Grifa Negra, she in the ends up claiming mestizaje, but affirming blackness at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Was it, you were talking about that, one of the ways to read Piri Thomas is to think about someone who's trying to name something that cannot be named. And I was wondering if, thinking of El Barrio, I remember that one of the readings, reading about the history of El Barrio, I encountered a revolt of sorts in which a lot of Puerto Ricans were attacked in El Barrio. And the way that it was reported, I believe this was in the 1920s, the way that it was reported in the mass media and the New York Times was that they were attacked by whites, and it was reported that these were West Indian Negroes who called themselves Puerto Rican. It went through an incredible sort of circumlocution to name these people that damn, why can't they just choose, what's wrong with them? And so there was, the idea of an excess that was very disturbing to the point of violence. The fact, they were attacked because these people would not define themselves, and thus created a lot of anxiety on whites who were poor and themselves kind of wondering, well, maybe I am not so white after all. So this whole idea of a kind of excess, something that cannot be articulated or named, and I'm just wondering how perhaps it appears in some of the other writings, and also how it might be both good and bad. I think that sometimes some of these writers actually affirm that, affirm the fact that, yeah, that's why I like hybrid, because it's something that is excessive, that cannot be named, and perhaps that might give me a little bit of, leeway, wiggle room or something.
And that became the kind of germ for Nuestra America, which really is an intervention into white supremacist tendencies of the leaders of a prior generation of Cuban nationalists, right? So Martí kind of challenging the whites. Granted, there's always this tendency towards patronizing in Martí, but it's also it's an intervention to kind of push the vision of a multiracial nation. But it's interesting because after Martí's death, there's this tension over defining his legacy, and there's the importation of U.S. racial policies to the new nation, and it's Sotero Figueroa, the Afro-Puerto Rican editor of Patria, who reclaims Martí's legacy against kind of the defamation of him. And it's in the context of that definition of defense of Martí that he also takes occasion to critique the leaders of the Sociedad Literaria Hispanoamericana for their racism, precisely because there was this idea of because Martí was conducting these talks on famous Latin American leaders, but it was sort of like viewed, it seems like, by the high society of New York as this sort of inappropriate kind of mixing going on. And so Sotero Figueroa talks about how some of the people in the Sociedad Literaria Hispanoamericana after Martí were sort of like, we don't want those people to be a part of, and feel, trying to somehow name in a context where it was impossible to talk about racism within the community, but trying to talk about it.
The first thing that came to mind when you asked that question, really thinking about Julia, if I think about Julia de Burgos' poetry, I mean, I think about the poetry, particularly poetry from her last two collections, her second and her collection that was published posthumously, the way that silence really functions in her poetry, right? And I wonder if that's sort of the same thing. Is that part of the way that she avoids being labeled or marked in any or categorized, right? I think part of what I guess I'm thinking about this because I'm also working on this chapter right now for my book, but I'm thinking about the way that in her second book, because I think that her first collection of poetry is very eclectic. She sort of draws from a variety of styles. I think she's still trying to figure out exactly what kind of poet she's going to be. But in her second collection, it's mostly love poetry. And there's a way that the erotismo of the poetry sort of escapes the definition of the role of the woman, right? And then in the second collection, I think by that point she's a little more pessimistic. The first collection is more optimistic, she's a little more pessimistic, and it's a lot of silence and sort of this desire, not even for death, almost for nothingness, right?
For death too?
Yeah, for death too, that's true.
This brings me to another question about her relationship with more contemporary writers. Many women writers, have actually seen her as a bad role model. And I think that part of that has to do with the whole idea of identity, the fact that they would like her to be, to more positively and affirmatively express an identity. And yet, Julia de Burgos seems to be coming from the 30s, where her thing was like, no, let's eliminate borders. Her avant-garde gesture is really to destroy that. I have too many identities. That's the problem. While when you get to the more contemporary, I'm thinking of Rosario, I'm thinking of what is the blue? What's her name? Sandra Maria Esteves. When you get to Sandra Maria, thank you. I heard it. So, Sandra Maria Esteves. They love her, but they, repeatedly in their poems, they go about denouncing her weakness.
Her weakness, focusing mostly on the relationship that she had with Grullo, right? I mean,
They
that's
assume,
a large part of
assume,
it. I think that the way that they sort of,
Right.
well, Sandra Maria says more the alcoholism, the alcohol.
She doesn't
Sandra
like
Maria
that.
critiques Julia for falling into alcoholism. Well,
She was bohemian.
And that was part of her. Who knows? I've heard of all kinds of readings from psychological analysis of how her father was an alcoholic, so it runs in the family. But I think again, both of those, it's La Carta a Julia that Rosario Ferrer writes, and the poem to Julia that Sandra Maria Esteves writes. The things that they criticize both again focus on the biography, right? I mean, it's focusing on biography, that why did you leave with this man? Why did you allow this man to treat you that way? Well, okay, let's look at what she did do. What did she do that was really sort of ahead of her time, and thinking about breaking down borders, as you said, and I think that you can see that. I've been looking recently at a lot of women artists. There's a fantastic artist. Though these images will be in my book. I'm going to talk about them in my book because I think they're fantastic. But writers from the visual artists from the Dominican Republic, from Mexico, who created the woman from Mexico created an altar to Julia. There's other woodcuts and images, and even Jasmine Hernandez's work on Julia de Burgos. I think really think about repositioning Julia de Burgos and thinking about her differently and sort of creating. And we have this day up now with Julia de Burgos too. So I think that I do think that their take on her is different from Sandra María Esteves and from Rosario Ferrer.
Yes.
So I don't know if I'm going on too long. If there's another question.
Yes. No, yes.
I had a comment back to the comment about excess, because I was thinking that one of the things that that we have to take into account is the particular historical context in which these texts are produced.
Right.
And in the case of the riots against the Puerto Ricans, I immediately thought about immediately thought about citizenship as an important event that changed the status of these colonial subjects, no, and created anxiety because they are citizens yet they are not fully belonging to the United States. They have a different culture. They are not white, and so that creates an indefinition that it becomes interesting, but also produces anxiety. And thinking about Fanon and Thomas, Fanon is writing just after the departmentalization of Martinique, and so that process of departmentalization actually meant that Martinique is part of France. It's France. So he's there, and he's supposed to be part of this country, yet they see him as an outsider due to his race. No? And so he doesn't know how to grapple with this, no? And Thomas is also thinking about the Congress passing these civil rights and voting acts, and the segregation happening in the North. And so what does that mean, for him, no? Because he doesn't think that these things have changed so much. So these things are, the law is changing, but people are not sure how to classify these subjects, and they find themselves in between categories, and so they are the object of anxiety, they're exoticized, and at the same time they have to answer their question about identity in a place that is not the place where they're supposedly belong. But Piri doesn't belong somewhere else, because I was born here, so where am I going to go? He never, he said, at the time he writes a novel, he says, I've never been to Puerto Rico, so this is my home.
Can I ask you to speak closer to the mic? We have students that is going on.
Okay. All right. So, questions, answers. Comments.
I have another question.
Yes.
How do you, thinking about the writers that you're studying, and then also somebody like Tomás Rivera, what do you see are the connections between the writers that you're focusing on and what becomes the literary legacy of Latino literature? When you look at somebody like Edbe Gayunque, or you look at somebody like Esmeralda Santiago, like how do you see their work, what they've done, laying the groundwork for what becomes much later?
I can begin with a general comment, because I think that Thomas opened a field without even knowing and without even wanting it. I think that he was trying to actually keep that space in which the category didn't exist, because he wanted to talk about the particular time period in which he was implicated, no? And so he kept insisting constantly in his interviews that he didn't identify necessarily as a Latino, maybe as a Puerto Rican, but not as a Latino, no? But I think that that didn't mean that he didn't see the way in which other Latino writers were producing their work as related to his, no? And for example, there is a younger poet, Willie Perdomo, who has a poem, the Nigerian Blues, that he dedicates to Piri Thomas, no? So they see him as the beginning of a field. Fanon is different. Fanon, for the longest time, even though people knew he was from Martinique, was sort of forgotten as part of the Caribbean tradition. And it has been recently that there has been several publications recovering his Caribbeanness and insisting on this particular period of his life, because his first book, he's insisting on his situation as an Antillean. Later on, he sort of removes himself from that kind of question, and he thinks himself as a French colonial subject.
and tries to link the Antilles with all the colonies in Africa, and so he doesn't identify as such. And I don't know if many Latino writers are using him. More Caribbean writers, I will say, are sort of going back to Fanon and seeing him as a foundational author.
It's so interesting because that sense of being something that there's no name for
Right.
is very much a part of what is going on with Martí also. I mean, like that whole thing where he's defining himself as a Spaniard, but he obviously doesn't identify with Spain. And then I think, talking about in that moment when he's in Coney Island, like, how we have a totally different reading, and in this whole kind of reaction to the massive consumption, this kind of surreal, disgusting consumption that he encounters, is also a moment of defining a different point of view. That then, it's so interesting because your question really touches on, this is something that I tried to tease out in my chapter, the way that it's in the reading of other writers that the tradition begins. So you have Sotero Figueroa editing, and then publishing, and then you have Jesus Colón and Bernardo Vega, all of them mention, they sort of define themselves in a tradition that Martí's linked to. And then you have Julio de Burgos writing poems dedicated to Martí, and it goes, and then you have Julio Ramos writing a novel which incorporates all of these characters, so that a tradition is created that becomes an alternative to the nation. And that becomes a kind of alternative tradition, an alternative archive. And so, but I just have one question. I know you're going to want to answer this, but I was just wondering if this lack of definition or this resistance to definition, I know Licia Fiormato talked about this a little bit, but is the metaphor of queerness applicable here? And it's just part.
To whom?
I mean, to this sort of lack of, definitely to Martí, but also to the lack of definition, the sort of resistance to definition, or definition through difference without any kind of fixed identity. In part because we were talking about Julio de Burgos in terms of like a queer feminist, queer feminism that's also heterosexual.
It's interesting because the other people that I didn't mention, the other readers of Julio de Burgos that I didn't mention, who actually like all of precisely the same things that Rosario Ferré and Sandra Maria Esteves, I'm blocking her. Sandra. Okay. What they reproach her is exactly what someone like Manuel Ramos Otero, who's a Puerto Rican gay writer, lacks. All of the images, every time that Julia, the poetic eye in Julia de Burgos is close to death, is close to disappearing, and there's about it's that moment, that liminal moment in which something might emerge, That's what he looks for. I mean, that's precisely the moment that he thinks of strength rather than weakness, And so that would be, I don't know, that's more of a queer reading, I suppose. I mean, there's another tradition of readings of Julia de Burgos that actually draws on that instability and that lack of definition. But I think that the most fabulous thing for me reading, Piri Thomas is, at least, I don't know, the way that I see the text is that this is a foundational text. It has become one. As you said, you become a foundational text because other people say you are a foundational text. Other people start rereading you in that manner. And you create other genealogies. And Julia de Burgos is the ultimate. I mean, she's the queen of that. I mean, everyone in Puerto Rico has to mention Julia de Burgos in order to speak. Julia de Burgos. Oh, okay, now I can write a poem. She has to allow you to write a poem,
But it's interesting you say that, because actually when Shamika asked the question, I was actually thinking about some of Julia de Burgos' writings that are not so well known, mostly what she wrote for the newspapers when she was here. Right? In the 1940s, she wrote for Pueblos Hispanos, and those essays haven't, or those journal articles haven't been translated into English. But so I don't know if that's part of the reason why they're not being focused on as much. But they aren't really being read very carefully. I suppose part of the reason is that they haven't really been republished, so you have to go into an archive to find them. But in those essay, those short pieces, if she's the art and culture editor for Pueblos Hispanos for a couple of years. And part of what she does, she says that her objective is to promote Latin American and Latino culture in the United States. And she interviews a lot of artists. Any artist, musician who comes to New York during that time, she interviews them. Some of the ones that are here already, she interviews them, talks to them. And one of the things that she highlights that I find very interesting, oh, I'm not speaking into the mic. That's a problem. One of the things that I find really interesting is that she, in writing up these interviews, she always focuses on the way that transnationalism works. And that I find very interesting, that she's so interested in that. You know, in 1940s, she talks a lot about the way that these artists really maintain this connection to the homelands, or their country of origin, or their parents' country of origin, because in the case of some of them, they were born here, and still sort of also have this sort of bicultural experience that they have, in the way that they are always concerned with what's going on at home and what's going on here. And that I find very interesting about Moderator. So I think that we can, so that I would say is part of her legacy towards Latino literature. She promotes this alliance among people of the Caribbean, looking at artists and mostly artists that are here from Haiti. She's very interested in interviewing them also, and including them as part of, and the importance for alliances for people from the Caribbean. And in some of these essays, she also writes about the importance of alliances with African Americans. So I think that all of that is part of her legacy towards, you know, and her influence on Latino literature that comes later, much later.
Well, hello. Questions, comments? All right. Comments? Concerns?
I guess I can
Okay,
add
there's one
something.
concern.
I don't know if I'm late on this, but today on the news, I saw that they're going to eliminate Hispanic from the race category.
On the census?
I thought I saw this on the news today. Maybe if I'm wrong, somebody could correct me.
Wow.
But
It wasn't on the race part, it was on the ethnicity. You
well,
always had to do white or black.
right.
So that was a problem.
And that you're forced to choose something now. I mean, you kind of always had to do that, but I don't know. It's on the news now. I don't know what your thoughts on that
I have
are.
to go back. I didn't even know about that. All I remember is that the census we have to answer if we were Hispanic, and that was the third question. And so I immediately thought that they were like tailoring them, and they knew that I was Martínez and Miguel, and so that's why I got that question. And so I called my friends to ask them, you know, and friends that are not Hispanic, you know, did you get this question in your census? So it could be an interesting, you know, backlash from that, you know, because it was quite interesting that the third question in the census was, are you Hispanic? You know?
Well, before the race question. Now it's
Right.
a question sort of like, are you Hispanic or non-Hispanic?
Yeah.
And then you define yourself racially.
Yeah.
So in my reading, it's all about expanding the definition of whiteness and kind of coaxing Hispanics to identify as white in order to maintain a white hegemony precisely at the moment when non-Hispanic whites are about to become a minority. So how do our writers speak to this question? I mean, and
Most of them don't call themselves Hispanic.
No.
they
that's
do
the
actually.
thing, yeah.
I mean, Pueblos Hispanos is an example.
Yeah.
Martí refers
Yeah.
to, you know,
Right.
los Hispanoamericanos. I mean, these terms were circulating. I
Well,
think.
Hispano it has a long
Yeah.
tradition, right? And especially among Mexican Americans too.
Yeah.
I mean, it has a long tradition. And I don't know. I mean, I can just tell you that I came to New York when I was 13 or 14, something like that, in the late 1960s, almost 1970. And Hispano was the term. I mean, Hispano that was it. That's circulated broadly. So.
But it has a very different meaning
It has
right
a different
now,
meaning,
because I'm
yeah.
thinking that now there are programs of Hispanic studies.
Yeah.
And so there was a time in which Hispanic referred to the migrants to this country, no? And at some point, you know, it changed to Latino to be supposedly more inclusive, but also as a reclaiming an identity that was not criminalized or defined by the state. No? And so people started talking about Latinos, but originally there was also a link of certain populations that were here and were brought in as colonial migrants and then became part of the identity of the United States. So you couldn't be, in principle, you know, I don't know, Panamanian and Latino. And now you can be from any part. Actually, you can even be Spanish and claim being
Latino. Yes.
Some of them are, you know, and so that has changed. You couldn't be Argentinian and Latino, now you can, you know. So that has changed.
Keep changing.
Yeah. One particular identity was quite the opposite. You know, if you want to know about me, you will have to know about all these different parts of me that are playing out at different moments. And so she plays with that beautifully, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great example.
Yeah.
I think it's a great sort of embracing a multiplicity of identities as opposed to trying to just be captured in one. I mean, sort of rejecting that and embracing a multiplicity of.
I'm so glad you brought up the East Coast, West Coast thing, in part because, well, of course, Vanessa is bringing some fresh West Coast perspectives to the East Coast, where for so long, where the East Coast is lagging behind because ethnic studies begins on the West Coast, right? I mean, and it took so long for Columbia to even think that they should do Asian American and Latino studies, and now they're considering it, right? So it's I mean, certainly, you know, that's been happening in CUNY for a much longer time. But I think, you know, this is part of another thing that the book is really accomplishing, is to sort of bring some of that important definition of what it is to do Latino studies.
Well, on that note, then thank you very much. Thanks for your